screen share. Is that okay?
Looks good.
Yeah. Okay, so the title of the talk is From Sensory Motor to Social Influences on Rhythmic Interpersonal Coordination. I guess the first question to answer is why the interest in rhythmic interpersonal coordination. As Jason just said, I'm interested in human interaction, and specifically in music context is something that's interested me a lot. And there, what's quite evident is the high level of precision yet flexibility that people can coordinate their actions and their sounds in this case. This is also, of course, the case in dance. It happens across cultures. But in fact, rhythmic interpersonal coordination occurs in other contexts, in some team sports, in some working crews, and of course in troop movement, marching and things like that. Now, apart from the precision and flexibility that humans display, what's also interesting, I think, is the large range of individual differences. So people's capacity for coordination varies and their ways of doing it as well. Okay, and the second part of the title is From Sensory Motor to Social. So why am I interested in this spectrum? Well, the background to this is the view that music is a microcosm of human interaction. And what the assumption is that participating in collective musical activities draws on a range of sensory, perceptual, cognitive, motor, and emotional processes that support other forms of social behavior more generally in life. And we recently published a paper where we argued that because of this quality, music can be a very useful domain in which to study more general processes underlying interpersonal coordination. And one of the advantages of doing it in a music context is that musical interactions are often quite systematic in ways, in the sort of rules of engagement that are employed, and they're structuring. And what this allows is it provides a platform for parametrically modeling the complexity of human social interaction. And when studied that way, one can actually devise paradigms that present different degrees of balance between experimental control and ecological naturalness. With respect to the individual differences that one sees in coordination, you can look at these at multiple levels. You can see individual differences between different people. So, for example, the degree of asynchrony that they display in a basic sensory motor synchronization task, like tapping a finger in time with a metronome. But you also see individual differences in the strength of coordination, the type of coordination across different musical styles and cultures. So in a recent large-scale study, we took recordings from various different types of groups in different cultures and measured the asynchrony between them. And you see, and these were done with highly skilled musicians, so presumably it's culturally valuable what they're doing. It's not that there's different degrees of error, they're actually meaningful degrees of asynchrony. So coordination can vary also across cultures in ways to serve perhaps certain expressive or aesthetic goals. But there's a lot in this in terms of what we want to understand in terms of sensory motor social influences on coordination and tying it into individual differences. So the approach that I've been taking is one which I call a telescopic research strategy, where at one level, I'm interested in naturalistic behavior, getting people in the lab, studying them with motion capture systems and recording their actions on electronic pianos and so on, or out in the field, so doing work with vocalists in a choir. We also then are interested in taking the same people into the lab and asking them to do laboratory tasks where we have some degree of experimental control and can interrogate specific processes and control or account for a range of factors in a systematic way. We also, to link to the social aspects, are interested in assessing things such as personality. And then to tie things together, what's happening at different levels of behavior and between laboratory tasks and naturalistic behavior, we use various computational modeling approaches. And finally, we're interested in the neurophysiological underpinnings of influences on interpersonal coordination. So look at brain structure and function. To guide the work, I've been using a theoretical framework. It's formulated in the context of musical ensemble performance, but because of this microcosm assumption that I I described earlier, I think it could indicate that these skills maybe generalize outside the music domain. And at the core are a set of 3 real-time online sensory motor and cognitive skills, and I've labeled them here: anticipation, adaptation, and attention. So, for example, in an ensemble, co-performers anticipate or predict the timing of their co-performers. If those predictions are not always right, so errors will occur, and then reactively adaptation mechanisms kick in to correct the errors, to allow coordination to be maintained. And finally, attention comes into the play. If you think of an ensemble situation, musicians pay attention and monitor what they're doing, their own actions, but also what co-performers are doing, and monitor or attend to the overall sound. Furthermore, in this framework, the proposal is that these 3 skills interact with one another, but they're also influenced by co-performer knowledge. So, for example, how well I know the part that you're playing in an ensemble, whether I've played the same part on a previous occasion myself, for example, or at least listened to it, how well I know the playing style, idiosyncratic ways of getting faster or slower that a performer may have. And then at another level, the skills are influenced by goals and strategies. One example of that is, for example, establishing leader-follower relationships. Okay, and finally, the idea is that all of this is influenced by social factors such as personality. Originally, quite some time ago, some basic evidence in favor of the idea that ensemble skills are related to coordination came from a study of piano duos, where we measured their keystroke asynchronies on a MIDI, electronic piano, and their body sway coordination. This is interesting theoretically because there are ideas that these measures are often related, but actually the body sway movements can convey information at longer time scales and maybe expressive information that might be redundant with or amplify expressive information encoded in the sounds of the performance. In any case, what we found was that lab-based tasks that measure the ensemble skills, anticipation, attention, and adaptation, in a series of pairs of pianists, predict their coordination at the level of body sway and also sounds. Here we can see body sway. Okay, so now I want to say a little bit more about how we assess adaptation and anticipation skills. So adaptation refers generally to reacting to interpersonal errors via correction mechanisms. And we study these in the lab, and this is Bruno Repp at Haskins Labs, when I was at Haskins and Yale. They're showing his setup from 20 years ago or so. And the idea is that one has a computer presenting a series of tones, a pacing sequence, and the task is to tap along in time with the tones. And in the more adventurous versions of the task, the tempo at which the computer is presenting tones will change, and the task then is to adapt to that tempo change. And these sequences go on for a bit longer, for half a minute or so, typically. And so the idea is that when you are doing such a task, while the tempo is steady, a process of phase correction that aligns the 2 streams of information, the 2 time series, the tones and the taps, comes into play. You can think about this as a basic form of coupling, and it's an automatic process, but as soon as there's a tempo change, a second process comes into play where the period of what we assume is some sort of internal timekeeper or oscillatory periodicity in the actor's brain changes to maintain synchrony with the new tempo, and this process is an effortful one. And we know this because when we do this in a dual task context, like ask people to do mental arithmetic while they're tapping along with these sequences, period correction is impaired, but phase correction is unimpaired and goes on. Then in terms of anticipation, we're referring to predicting what, when, and how for others' actions. But here we're specifically interested in the when, the timing. And one of the tasks that we use is one where, again, we have a computer sequence that's presenting a series of tones. And in this case, the tones, the inter-onset interval between tones get longer or shorter systematically. So you end up with tempo changes, sort of gradually getting faster and slower, faster, slower, like a musical piece might be performed, at least in certain musical traditions. And the task is to tap along and tap in time with the sequence. What we actually do is, you can see these green lines here, vertical and the diagonal. The vertical lines indicate, you can imagine doing a cross correlation if this sequence again went on for 60 taps or so, where you look at the correlation at lag 0 between inter-onset intervals and inter-tap intervals, or lag 1. And we assume that the lag 0 cross correlation indicates how well you're predicting the tempo changes, because if you've predicted the next change, your interval will match that interval. Whereas if you're tracking or following the tempo changes rather than predicting them, you'll have a higher lag 1 cross correlation. So we use that as a measure. We've done that with individuals where we test their prediction tracking tendencies individually. Okay, and then we bring them in together into the lab and ask them to tap together. And this is kind of ecological validity for the assumption. We find that people who we've classified as predictors individually, when we pair them together, they have smaller dyadic asynchrony than people who we've classified as trackers, and mixed pairs are in the middle, kind of. Okay, so those are two different aspects of coordination, the reactive and the predictive. What we've also found is that they are correlated. So going back to individual differences, when we estimate phase correction in a sample of people and also their prediction index, we find that these measures are correlated, not perfectly. It's probably the case that they are using the same underlying timing mechanism. But then if we go a bit further and look at, do a hierarchical regression where we enter the estimates in a series of steps, we find independent contributions. Okay, so phase correction accounts for a lot of variance in people's synchronization skill, but then an independent extra 15% is explained by the prediction index scores, and then there's other things going on as well. Okay, so to understand all these things that are going on, I mentioned computational models earlier. One that we've been working with is what we call the ADAM model. It stands for Adaptation and Anticipation Model of Sensory Motor Synchronization. And you'll see periods that are processes that I referred to a moment ago. The idea is that when doing a synchronization task, as we do in the lab, we have another person's sounds, our taps are generating sounds as well. There are asynchronies between those because there's noise in the system, several sources of noise in the biological system driving it, the participant at least. And these asynchronies are the basis for reactive adaptation mechanisms, phase and period correction, as I described earlier. And the other sounds, on the other hand, are the basis for making predictions. So I won't go into the details about this. I think I have the equations about how it's developed. It's just a linear extrapolation process to generate predictions about when the next sound will occur. And that's weighed against a perseveration process just to copy the previous interval. Okay, so it's doing a linear extrapolation across the previous two intervals, or copying just this interval and weighting that. And then the idea is that the predictions are fed to an internal model of the other, and that gives us a prediction about the timing of their next action. Meanwhile, the adaptation model has fed its output to an internal model of the self, and that plays a role in action planning. So I'm not going into the background from computational movement neuroscience in internal models. I assume that most of you are familiar with the concept in general, at least. And then the output of the internal models of self and other are compared and fed into a joint internal model, okay, the joint action. And there, if the difference between what I'm planning to do and what my prediction says you're going to do exceeds a certain threshold, an anticipatory correction process kicks in. And this aims to reduce the asynchrony between an event that hasn't yet happened, okay, between my plan and the prediction of the other's action. And this can be used to update my own internal model before a motor command is issued. This is the more novel aspect of the model. Okay, these other processes have been dealt with before and by others. The idea is that this is where attention comes in, and specifically the proportion of attention to self versus other, either more segregated or integrated, if attention to self-other relations is enhanced, is what drives the overall magnitude of this anticipatory correction response. Because it's it ends up being kind of a simple linear system, the model parameters can be estimated analytically, even actually in real time while doing the task. And the sort of task that we use is synchronization with the virtual partners. We have different types of tasks. I mentioned the tempo changing sequences before. That's used to assess prediction specifically, or at least it puts demands on prediction. But we also use tasks where we use the model actually to drive a computer virtual partner to implement different degrees of adaptation and thereby be cooperative to varying degrees. Okay, so when we do this, so here's the model again, and here are just some histograms showing counts of a sample of, I think, 90 people or something like this. Their adaptation estimates, just for phase correction, I think, and their anticipation estimates and their joint model estimates. And when we put those together, we see here now color-coded the degree of asynchrony on an independent task, so not the one we use to assess their ensemble skills, and find that these three skills do combine to predict quite well how well people can coordinate in general. We've done this study, and the advantage of it is it's a very simple task, so it can be studied with different neuroimaging modalities. And in MRI, we've done this using functional MRI in a form of functional connectivity analysis. We've identified brain networks associated with the different atom modules. And the general idea here is that what happens is, the brain has various resting state networks that can interact and reconfigure one another depending on the task at hand. And this particular task leads to very specific ways in which the resting state models are configured to become atom models when placed in this particular task context. One thing that's interesting is that the joint module seems to be playing a role in regulating the brain's level of metastability, so its ability to transition to different states. This is very important for flexible behavior, and I think this is especially important when we're talking about the sorts of tens of millisecond precision yet flexibility that we see in these rhythmic interpersonal coordination tasks. So for the rest of the talk, what I want to do now is, I've given you the background, hone in on three aspects: the role of a bit more about the sensory motor and cognitive skills, then a bit more about how the higher order cognitive processes influence these, so knowledge and goals. And then finally, if there's time, maybe, I don't know if it's the most interesting aspect for you, but some links with personality, how personality influence the way these relationships are manifest. Okay, so sources of individual differences at the sensory motor and core cognitive skill level. So in one line of work, I've been working together with a collaborator who's in Belgium now, Sylvie Nazaradan, looking at neural indices of adaptation and anticipation using steady state evoked potentials recorded with EEG. Okay, so just globally. And the idea is that the magnitude of these potentials. So the idea is recording EEG, then doing a fast Fourier transform and looking at the magnitude of frequency content in different regions of the spectrum of the electrical activity. And what one finds is that there are peaks in the activity that are aligned with the beat of the musical of a musical rhythm. So in this particular study, we have an unsyncopated rhythm in the sense that the X's represent sounds and the dashes above them represent beats. There's a sound occurring on each beat. In contrast to a syncopated rhythm, where there are, again, the same number of sounds, but they don't all coincide with beats. So if you think about jazzy rhythms where expectancies are violated by having a strong beat that doesn't actually have a strong beat in terms of mental representation of the temporal structure that isn't accompanied by a physical onset in the sound. And that's kind of exciting to listen to. And original question was, what happens in the brain in terms of representing the beat when there isn't physical information in the acoustic signal that's very strongly suggesting one. What one finds is that in the unsyncopated case, you have fairly large response at the beat frequency, but you still have a response at the beat frequency in the syncopated, although it's smaller in magnitude. And what we think is going on is the process of finding the beat and maybe in training to it can be arrived at in different ways, kind of bottom-up way, exogenously driven by the physical sound onsets, but it can be also imposed to some degree endogenously. Okay, and that's what's going on more in the syncopated case. Now, what's interesting about this, when we take this measure and then looking at it at the individual participant level, we find that the overall strength, irrespective of syncopated, unsyncopated, exogenous, and endogenous, is correlated with the accuracy in tapping. So people who have strong steady state evoked potentials at the beat frequency also have close to zero asynchrony when tapping. And we think this is due to adaptation relying on a phase coupling mechanism. Now, to get at a measure that's correlated with their anticipation or temporal prediction abilities, we do a little trick where we simply subtract the unsyncopated peaks from the syncopated, and we're assuming that this subtraction, is identifying more the endogenous component here. And we find that then that is correlated with their prediction index from our tempo changing task. Okay, so this indicates that there's something higher level going on in the case of the tempo change prediction. And we see this, in fact, in other work, looking at the relationship between temporal prediction and working memory and auditory imagery. So this is work with Ian Coley and Andrea Halpin, where we had people tapping along to real expressive time music. This is an example of a piece by Chopin. And the inter-onset intervals vary. So this is actually inter-onset profile of actual performers playing this piece, and the beat is not constant. It's around 600 milliseconds between beats, but it certainly varies. And we ask people to tap along with it, and then we get our measure of temporal prediction. And we find, and we assess their working memory, using the standard sorts of batteries, and then find that working memory contributes to temporal prediction. It's not correlated with overall asynchrony or beat perception alone. And then again, independent contributions of assessments of the control of auditory imagery, and specifically imagery for timing information. So working memory probably plays a role in storing and processing the beat intervals, and this information is used in controlling the images that serve as tangible traces of prediction. Okay, so again, there's a big slice of variance. Sorry, you can't see, I'm pointing at my screen, but around 50% of the variance isn't accounted for by these measures. Again, there's other stuff going on, and it's probably more motor related. And evidence for this comes from a study with my colleague Giacomo Novembre, where we use transcranial alternating current stimulation in a joint action context, so two people tapping together. And what the aim was here, to see whether we could use such electrical stimulation to enhance or boost people's interpersonal coordination. Now, you can think, that's a little bit naive to start with, but we decided to explore different conditions and have very specific predictions about what might work. So we fitted both participants out. They were in separate rooms. They couldn't see or hear each other between trials, with attacks set up with the anodal positive electrode above the left motor cortex, and they're tapping with the right hand. And then we stimulated them in either in-phase or anti-phase relationship at 3 frequencies. 2 hertz corresponded to the rate at which they were supposed to be tapping, together. 10 hertz is alpha frequency, very dominant brain rhythm and often implicated in social processing tasks. And then 20 hertz, which is more commonly related to motor processing. So we're actually very interested in in-phase 20 hertz stimulation, was what we were predicting. And the task involved the stimulation was turned on. They were told to prepare to tap. They weren't given any feedback for 3 seconds. And then they had to start tapping together. They didn't see or hear each other until they started tapping. And then they only heard each other. And what we found was selective enhancement in coordination only as predicted for the beta, for the motor related stimulation in an in-phase relationship. So what we think was going on was that it was probably biasing their estimates of when they gauge somebody to start tapping and the tempo at which they were tapping to be more aligned. It's a little bit speculative, but in any case, it's an empirical result to maybe think about further. Why we think that it's another reason why we think that it's a motor related process, and specifically actually a process of motor simulation, using one's own action system, motor system, to simulate or run offline something corresponding to the other's action and use that to make predictions about the timing of that action is a transcranial magnetic stimulation study where we used a double pulse, a sort of interfering protocol, where the participants were required to come in and play the right-hand melody of a piano piece, listening to a recording of somebody else playing the left-hand part. There was a tempo change that occurred in the left-hand part. It was unpredictable whether it would go faster, slower, and by what amount. So what happened when the tempo changed, people had to quickly update their predictions about what the next event timing would be. And just to make things tricky for them, we delivered the double pulse right before that point. And we wanted to see whether it would interfere with their ability to predict the tempo changes. And the one trick that we did here that's very important is that for half the pieces, we had the pianist rehearse the left-hand part beforehand. And we assumed that if they rehearse it, they're going to have a more high fidelity simulation of the piece because they've actually motorically produced it themselves, and we tested they could do it by memory. Versus the case when they haven't rehearsed the other part, they won't know exactly what the next sound will be. And what we find is that the interference of TMS is only observed in the train case. So knocking out the simulation when it's there interferes with the ability to update predictions. Right. So on top of adaptation and anticipation, I was talking about the attention component, and what I think is important there, and this relates to the conceptualization in the atom model, is the role of attention in balancing self versus self-other priorities. Now, talking to musicians, they seem to see this phenomenologically as something that's relevant, and they get even quite mystical about it. So this is a French trio, the trio Wanderer, where they describe playing together as being like a holy trinity. It's three individuals in a group, and both things, individuality and group, are equal and very important. So when we think about it psychologically, why is simultaneous self-other merging and distinction important? Well, integrating is important to maintain, to gauge the relationship between self and other, to see whether the joint goals are being met. Whereas segregation is important, at least to some degree, because one has to still maintain autonomy over one's own actions and have agency for it. If there's confusion in that, it could compromise the degree to the effectiveness of correction mechanisms. For example, if I lost track of whether I'm producing the sound early or late. If any of you have sung in a choir with a lot of people, when it's hard to hear your own voice, it can be a bit disorienting. And where attention comes into it is through a concept which I've referred to as prioritized integrative attending, the idea that in an ongoing interaction, one monitors the self, others, and the overall sound. And this can vary to varying degrees depending on the demands. For example, if I have a motorically demanding rhythmic pattern to execute in my part, perhaps I'll just be focusing on myself at that point. But at other points, if I'm an accompanist playing something simple and repetitive and somebody else has something I have to coordinate with, maybe more the other. And if those are interlocking in a complex, intricate way, maybe the joint. Okay. When we look, okay, what's evidence for there being any effects of this in terms of what we can measure? With work with Merle Fairhurst a while ago, we were looking at brain networks of self-other integration and segregation. And to do this, we used, in terms of the behavioral task, our synchronization with virtual partner tasks. So we had people tapping along, and they were in the MRI scanner with virtual partners that were programmed to implement different degrees of adaptivity, actually phase correction. So they were their coupling strength basically varied. Here they were correcting the virtual partner for a quarter of the error, half of the error, each successive asynchrony, that is, up to full. What's interesting, and then we measure the variability of the interaction between the participant and the computer, and we find this U-shape function where actually full correction on the part of the computer is not helpful, because you have to remember that phase correction in the human is automatic. So the human is doing it and they're actually kind of overshooting each other. So it actually inflates variability. You have this kind of sweet spot, okay, when both the computer and the human are using moderate amounts of phase correction. What's interesting, however, when you look across this range of values and then look at what's going on in the brain in terms of activations, you see a switch in the brain networks that are involved, or at least associated with the behavior, when you switch from the moderate sweet spot level to the higher level. So when coordination is fairly automatic, it favors self-other integration, and you see midline regions often associated with social affective and self-referential processing. And then as soon as you get outside this zone, you switch to these right lateralized networks that are more often associated with executive functioning and cognitive control. Another task we've used, and this is more recent development with my colleague Manuel Vallet in Sydney, it uses again the steady state evoked potential. And in the first demonstration, we used a visual task, joint movement improvisation. It's actually related to the mirror game task, which Leo Noy, I don't know if any of you know, Leo has been using. And the twist here was that when people were performing this task, so they just have to track each other, their movements in the horizontal plane, sitting opposite as shown here. And we place light emitting diodes in the finger, and these flicker at different frequencies. So 5.7 hertz and 7.7, unique to each performer. And what the assumption is that we can get a measure of the balance of self-other integration segregation by looking at EEG amplitude at the intermodulation frequency. So the sum of these two, okay, so 13.4 hertz. And when you look at this, you indeed do see peaks at the frequencies of the individual flickers, okay, but also at the intermodulation frequency. What's most interesting is when you look at the strength of the sort of average across participants, the EEG amplitude at the intermodulation frequency, it's correlated with the standard deviation of the distance between performers in terms of behavior. Okay, so it's related. The strength of the intermodulation frequency or integration of the self and other predicts how tight the synchrony is behaviorally. And then we've extended this to the auditory domain. The task's a bit different. I probably don't have time to go through all the details, and it's really preliminary here, where we have people producing a sound. So they're contacting a sensor on the table, and this produces a sound that has a certain carrier frequency, either a high or low pitch tone, and it can either be the same pitch tone for each person or a different pitch tone. Okay, and what they're doing is applying pressure, and they can decide the sort of timing of how they apply the pressure, and that changes the timbre of the sound. So correlated with brightness, it changes from a triangle wave to a square wave, basically. Okay, which makes the sound more nasal or more open, and they can produce these improvisations together using this device. And again, now we have tagged the envelope of the sound at either 33 or 47 hertz. And again, we can look at intermodulation frequencies, either the sum or the difference. And again, we see it's a bit weaker here, but we see peaks in the steady state evoked potentials auditory now in the EEG at the intermodulation frequencies. And now what we see in terms of the data are that when the sound frequencies match, that's the basic sound frequency, low or high. So when people are both playing low sounds or high sounds, there's more integration, as you would expect. But when you look at behavior, you see that actually has a cost here. You see that their interpersonal synchronization, where here high values are good coordination, is better when their frequency is unmatched. So it seems when they're producing the same sound, they're perhaps confusing self and other. And so full integration is not necessarily useful. And just to finalize this part, indeed, in a lot of real world situations, you've got both going on, and perhaps in different modalities. If you think about some musical contexts and others, you're not only hearing what the other co-performer is doing, but you see them, and visual information can influence how you couple with them. So here we used a task where people were playing these electronic music boxes. So they rotate a lever and they can play a tune which is pre-programmed. Here the tune is Somewhere Over the Rainbow, which is a familiar one for them. And they just have to regulate the tempo and play together. So novices, people without musical training can do it. And what we varied in this experiment was whether they're playing, again, in the same octave, the same sounds, the same pitches, or several octaves apart. And we thought that would be like the previous experiment. Maybe it might be better when they're several octaves apart because you can maintain your autonomy more effectively. But we also vary the movement frequency. So either you had to do, a rotation. One beat was either a third of a rotation or a quarter of a rotation. So it was making a 3 to 4 polyrhythm almost between the two people's actions in one condition, or they were moving with the same movement frequency, congruent. And what we found was that coordination was best when the movement frequency was the same, but the sounds were different. Okay, and in fact, that's the condition here in the red. So you've got absolute asynchronies, and across the trial, all the participants can maintain synchrony, whereas all other conditions, they would drift apart. It was a disaster, actually, from a musical point of view, but interesting from an experimental point of view. So when they can integrate in the visual domain, but segregate in the auditory domain, that was actually optimal in this particular task. Okay, so moving on to the second part, knowledge, goals, and strategies. In a study of piano duos, we used a manipulation of knowledge that I described before, where we have people practice the other person's part before the experiment for half a set of items, half a set of pieces, whereas the other half they don't. So that manipulates familiarity with the other part. And in terms of goals, we refer specifically to goals regarding tempo. And we can set up the situation so that people have congruent or incongruent tempo goals. I'll tell you how we do that in a moment. Here we go. Before each trial starts, so they're playing piano pieces. One pianist plays one hand, the other pianist the other, and they play a short phrase, and then there's a pause, and then they continue with a second phrase. These are Bach, chorales by Johann Sebastian Bach. And before they start playing, they're given a signal for pianist 1 and 2, whether to play the second phrase slower or faster than the first phrase. And they've been trained to play a specific tempo. Unbeknownst to them, in some conditions, they're given incongruent cues. One person's told to get slower and the other is told to get faster. And we actually cut off the sound for the second phrase. So during the experiment, they don't know that this is going on, in fact, because they're isolated in separate rooms. What we find when we look at their behavior, so the asynchrony of keystrokes between performers, is that only the tempo congruence manipulation has an effect. What's interesting here, I'm talking about the first phrase. So everything I'm talking about in this experiment is just for the first phrase. So they're meant to be playing at the same tempo here, but they're anticipating the second phrase. And when they're anticipating a different tempo, it already affects their tempo in the first phrase. It's like a co-articulation effect in speech, but at quite a long time scale, in fact, several seconds before. And then when we look over here on the right, this is a proxy for coupling strength, the correlation between the performers into keystroke intervals at lag 0. The closer to 0 that is, the stronger the coupling. And we see that the familiarity has an effect where they're more strongly coupled in the unfamiliar condition. The idea is here that if you haven't practiced the other person's part, you're more likely to attend to them during the interaction. When you've practiced their part before, you don't rely so much on what they're doing, as it turns out, at least in this context. So familiarity weakens interpersonal coupling. This study we were collecting EEG from the pianist. We're not looking at any interbrain synchrony in this particular version, but rather just the power in here. The alpha frequency band was turned out to be interesting, where we think specifically it's providing an index of self-other integration and segregation. What we see here is normalized alpha power. And in the familiar condition, when people are weakly coupled, you see alpha suppression in the congruent case and enhancement in the incongruent case. So alpha suppression is indicating increased processing of task relevant information, okay, the other performer, whereas alpha enhancement is suppressing irrelevant information. So that's what we think is going on there. When people are weakly coupled but in sync, so when it's congruent, the external focus focuses on integration, alpha suppression. But when weakly coupled and out of sync, internal focus, when you're familiar, facilitates segregating and not being interfered with by the incongruent tempo of the other, reflected in alpha enhancement. We've pushed that even further, where we have that was a pretty subtle manipulation of tempo, where we really tell people beforehand that they have to get either slower or faster as they're playing continuously. So not just now a new tempo, but tempo modulations. And we have congruent situations where both performers are given the same score, told to get slower and faster at the same time, or incongruent, where they're actually told to do the opposite to one another. And we sit them down and tell them to keep playing and just sort it out without talking. What we find is, of course, as they repeat the performances, their asynchrony decreases, but they're always worse off in the incongruent condition when they've got different things. But still, they are negotiating to some degree to improve in that condition, and it occurs rapidly from trial to trial and without any verbal communication. And what we think is going on here is the balancing of prioritizing their individual goals, that is to stick to the tempo that they've been told to play, versus the joint outcome. So integrating self and other. And we estimate this by looking at the correlation between keystroke intervals of the two pianists, so that's a measure of the joint goal, or the individual pianist and their score. Okay, so the sort of target intervals that we've told them to play. And what we find is the joint goal doesn't change across congruent, incongruent conditions. So this horizontal line intersects at the same point, but it's the individual goal that changes, where it actually reduces. So they're kind of what we think linear mixed effects model shows the same thing. You can predict the joint outcome, but not the individual outcome. What we think is happening is people are sacrificing their joint goal to some degree, probably by establishing leader-follower relationships where one person adapts to the other more than vice versa. Together, these studies suggest that there's a goal congruence threshold. So the balance between self-other integration and segregation is influenced by the degree to which individual expressive goals differ. So when it's only a subtle difference, so there's a low goal incongruence, this encourages segregation. That's like in the first study I described. And the second study, where we have this more sledgehammer approach with we telling people to do completely different things at the same time, high goal incongruence encourages self-other integration. So this threshold at which it becomes necessary to revise and modify one's own goals in order to achieve precision in coordination exists. Yeah, so, I mean, I think I'm kind of out of time. Or do you want me to talk 5 minutes about the personality aspect, Jason? How do you go with timing?
Yeah, it'd be great if you can talk about that. I'm interested.
Okay, good. So now I've developed an interest in how aspects of personality, and specifically empathy and locus of control, interact with basic ensemble skills at a sensory motor level. Locus of control refers to the degree to which you attribute things that happen to you, to your own action, to internal or external causes. And it can be assessed by this particular instrument here. And one of the subscales, the internality subscale, contains items such as whether or not I get to be leader depends mostly on my own ability. Another example is if I fail an exam, is it because if I'm internal locus of control, I'd say it's because if I'm internal locus of control, I'd say it's because I'm hopeless, I didn't work hard enough. And if I'm external, I say it's because the professor was bad and gave the wrong information, for example. Empathy, on the other hand, refers to understanding other thoughts and feelings, and can be assessed by something such as the interpersonal reactivity index, which has a number 4 subscales for different cognitive and emotional aspects of empathy. We're mostly interested in the perspective taking subscale. So putting yourself psychologically in somebody else's shoes. An example of an item: before criticizing somebody, I would try to imagine how I would feel if I were in their place. Okay, so in earlier work, we found that locus of control affects adaptation. So synchronizing with, in this case, virtual partners that are unstable. We program the virtual partner in the computer to implement period correction. And with high degrees of period correction, it has an unstable internal timekeeper. So if it detects, once it starts to get slower, it ends up on this slippery slope where it gets slower and slower and slower unless the human really tries to intervene. So what we tell the humans to do, the participants that is to synchronize with the virtual partner, but we warn them it might go off the rails sometimes, so they have to maintain the tempo themselves to some degree. What we find is the way that people prioritize these two instructions, to synchronize with the computer but also maintain the tempo, depends on locus of control. So people who are external locus of control, they try to synchronize with the computer, and they adapt. So measures of human adaptation are higher in them than the internal locus of control people, who, if the going gets rough, they just focus on their own action, stabilizing the tempo, and don't adapt to the computer. Again, we do this in the scanner, and we find that regions that are stronger in leaders than in followers, or internal than in external, are related to self-monitoring. Or regions related to self-monitoring are stronger activated in leaders than in followers. With regard to empathy, we've taken another approach. We go back to our music box task, but in this case, we assess perspective-taking capacities before the experiment and then pair people up to be either dyads composed of 2 high empathy people, high perspective taking, or 2 low empathy people. And we find that the high empathy people are have much smaller asynchronies between them than the low empathy people. Okay, what's going on? Well, we also have a condition where we assign leader-follower relationships. We tell one person to lead the interaction, the other to follow. And what we find is that when you're a leader, it doesn't matter if you're a high or low empathy person, you make your actions more regular. You make the tempo more regular to help the follower. This is known as a coordination smoother, and it has been observed in a number of contexts. Where empathy comes in is the followers. Followers are better at using that more reliable, predictable information if they're high in empathy than if they're low in empathy. Okay, so that's what seems to explain what's going on. When we look in another context, synchronizing with tempo changing sequences, again in the scanner, we find 3 broad networks that are where activity is correlated with behavioral measures of prediction, our temporal prediction index. These are networks that can be linked to sensory motor integration, to action simulation, but most interestingly to social cognitive processing. So here you can see the regions highlighted in green. We're actually most interested in posterior cingulate and precuneus, but generally these regions are interesting to the extent that they overlap nicely with those observed in other studies for other aspects of empathy, even actually to empathy for pain, of all things. Okay, just quickly, the study I mentioned before, where we use double pulse TMS to interfere with updating of predictions in this task, we find that the degree of impairment is correlated with people's perspective taking scores. And what we think is going on here is that when you are relying on internal action simulations, highly empathic people are more likely to rely on these in such a task. So when you knock it out, they suffer more as a consequence. Okay, so finally, I just want to present the last study that links together the behavioral measures, parameters, and personality. We have people doing dyadic synchronization tasks. They're both drumming together, firstly for a few tones where they synchronize with an external pacing sequence, which drops out and then they continue. And we studied 80 people, 40 pairs, and they do this task under different conditions. Either the tempo is regular or it's varying, as in our tempo varying task that I've described before. And they're either doing it at a generally slow or fast tempo. Don't worry about that. I'm going to just present the variable tempo. The variable conditions collapsed across tempo. But what's important is that we vary leadership instructions. So in the variable case, we can either not tell them who's going to be leading or assign one of them to lead the tempo changes. When we use the ATOM model to estimate their parameters in terms of adaptation, period correction specifically, because it's a tempo changing task, the prediction tracking coefficient, and anticipatory error correction, we find that the leadership manipulation just affects the degree of adaptation, where the person following is adapting a lot more to the leader, and the leader basically stops adapting and just focuses on their own actions. When we look more closely, generally at not just effects of leader-follower, but what's predicting their overall level of coordination, we run hierarchical regression analyses where we enter either the average scores of the pair members on these parameters or the difference between pair members, and find that, for example, the average of their period correction is a predictor of their coordination. So a dyadic asynchrony. So high period correction means lower asynchrony, better coordination. But then you get, in a second step, you get also an influence of the prediction tracking. But here it's in fact, so higher prediction is correlated with better performance. The difference between people is correlated with better performance, meaning that one person is predicting the other. So again, this fits with establishing leader-follower relationships, although perhaps not the ones instructed, because it doesn't correlate with that. Just to end, the relationship between personality measures and the estimates in this task of adaptation, period correction, and anticipation, prediction tracking revealed something we've seen before, a relationship with internal locus of control and adaptation and empathy and prediction. Okay. However, that study didn't reveal anything interesting about the joint internal model, which this is the final thing, to say that we think that we have to go even to a higher level than personality and get into people's beliefs and their attitudes generally to interacting with other people socially. So here we did a task where we had people drumming in separate rooms. They were always drumming with a computer that was controlled by the experimenter that implemented a virtual partner, but we did tell the people that they were either interacting with the other human or the computer. And we tested that we checked that they believed this manipulation. It was always a computer. And what we found when we asked them afterwards whether they prefer interacting with humans or computers, those people who said they preferred interacting with humans did better when they thought it was a human. And those people who said they prefer interacting with computers did better when they thought it was a computer. It was always the same signal. So that it was really a belief manipulation. And there we find that what explains this pattern best is the joint internal model. So they're more likely to integrate self and other when it's with a preferred partner. Okay, so to conclude, ensemble skills interact with knowledge and goals to facilitate rhythmic interpersonal coordination. Individual differences do arise, and these just aren't only due to the operation of the ensemble skills, but actually links between these basic processes and personality. And these links between the sensory motor mechanisms and social cognitive processes serve to regulate the balance between self-other integration and segregation, and thereby you could even say more generally psychological representations of self and other. And that's all I have. I thank my collaborators, funding bodies, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thanks a lot, Peter. If people have questions, I think now's a good time to ask. Maybe I'll start off. Sorry, Amir, do you want to go ahead?
Just a quick one. It was really interesting. Thank you. Most of your examples in the talk were actually looking at temporal coordination, auditory coordination. You briefly touched spatial coordination, motor actions. Do you imagine these to be via the same pathways, routes in the nervous system, or are they interacting because they're different, or interacting because they're via the same pathways? That's my question.
Yeah, that's an important question. Thanks for that. To some degree, different. In fact, and to be honest, I would have to say I described the atom model, but of course I'm aware and actually work with people who are using other approaches, such as the nonlinear oscillators, the sort of dynamical systems approach, and they're. I've often been challenged by my colleagues in that field. What I think is going on is that there are processes going on at generally two levels. One of those that I think are the intentional coordination, and that's what the musicians are doing in terms of intending to produce a series of tones with a certain timing profile and a pitch profile and other dimensions as well. But as you said, I've been focusing on timing. But of course, the body movements that they produce, that they need to produce to generate those sounds, are continuous. And the atom model doesn't say anything about that, and doesn't say anything directly about the influence of through visual perceptions, through visual motor coupling, what influence that will have. And that's where I think making a hybrid approach where oscillators are driving the visual aspect, but this has to then link up, I think, with the cognitive intentional aspect. So it's what's going on at the intentional, unintentional level. Of course, there's some seepage or leaking between those because in ensemble coordination, performers don't always look at other performers and rely on the visual cues, but sometimes they do. If there's a pause in the music, if there's going to be an abrupt change where you need to take a cue from somebody, and of course in a large ensemble where you might have a particular individual directing the ensemble, such as a drum major in marching or a conductor in an orchestra.
Thank you very much.
May I ask a question? Thank you very much for this report of studies. I remember Kelso was referring that some synchronization between individuals can also imply some rules on on synchronization between two hands, for example, two legs, etc. Can we do something like that with your studies as well? Do you have any data that your model is actually applying to synchronization between two hands?
Yeah, to be honest, I haven't got anything concrete on that, but one avenue for exploring it, and actually where I am now in Aarhus, they're very interested in this. My colleague Peter Wust has done a lot of work on polyrhythm production, as have Kelso and colleagues, Jeff Summers and others. So generating sequences bimanually with complex ratios or different ratios, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and so on. And that presents, I think, a good paradigm where you've got nice effects. For example, descriptions of when there are the phase transitions to a simpler ratio, the fairy tree type conceptualization, if that means something to some of you. So one can do that between individuals. And actually, we did do one study now that I've been thinking as I'm talking with a Japanese colleague, Kohei Miyata. It was just, we have a series of studies, in fact, where we have people who asked, he's a street dancer. So I was very excited having a street dancer come to the lab to work with me, but I found out that actually street dance, like many complex actions, can be broken down into very simple components. And the only component he was interested in, I can even demonstrate, being a non-dancer, was basically this, just a vertical knee bend is one component of a street dance. And of course, experts go on to do many other things, but that's a basic component to move in time in a vertical dimension with the beat. So we actually have people doing this task, and we measure individually when they're likely to, and we ask them to do it either flexion on the beat or extension on the beat. An extension on the beat is less stable if you have increasing plateaus of tempo change, getting faster, 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 and watch when they transition to flexion on the beat. So very much in the vein of the Kelso type studies, but now with the whole body movement, you find that people transition on the beat. When you have two people doing it, you find that the person who has an earlier transition time is likely to have a greater influence on the person and muck up their performance. It's not really getting to your question, actually, but yeah, that sort of paradigm could get at it. We also have people vocalizing on the beat, and that allows them to hang on longer as the tempo changes progress before they fall into a phase transition. And when they do it together, it can help, unless your partner is a weak link, so to speak. So it didn't really answer your question. I think that the polyrhythm paradigms, which you can do bimanually and could maybe do with this sort of street dance paradigm, where you actually ask people to synchronize in different ratios and could see whether similar constraints operate across the context.
Thank you.
I have another question. Thanks. It was a fascinating talk. You mentioned that empathy is associated with anticipation in beat. Have you tried to look at the connection between the personality traits and empathy of the performer and the affect in music, manipulating affect by manipulating tonal traits, for example, or
No, yes. I haven't. Others have. To be honest, I now won't be able to pull up specific studies, but I can have a look later. It certainly has been looked at. I mean, the initial study, early study that I'm aware of that was quite interesting, was not specifically on empathy, but on social intelligence. Emotional intelligence. So I think actually Bruno Repp was involved in this work, where they had pianists come into the lab and play the same piece of music with different expressive goals to make it sound happy or sad or angry or something. I can't remember the exact things, and then played those examples to a large cohort of Yale undergraduates and assessed their emotional intelligence, and found that higher emotional intelligence allowed people to pick which emotion was being conveyed in the music, expressed in the music performance more accurately. So I'm imagining that's quite strongly correlated with perspective taking and empathy, but it didn't look at specifically that. And as I said, I have heard or come across studies of that nature, but I can't tell you details, I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm.
I had a question, Peter. So we've been doing some studies looking at older people performing synchronization tasks, and we see them less good at synchronizing with each other. Do you have any ideas about in terms of the Adam model, what would be the cause of them being less good at synchronizing?
Yep. Yes. I can't give a specific hypothesis, but I can point to several potential factors. One is, have you noticed the preferred motor tempo slows down with age? Yeah, and we know this this relationship where slower the tempo, the higher the variability, kind of fits with the Weber's law kind of thing. I think it sort of scales with variability, scales with tempo. So that could be part of it. I think it's going to be a case where there are several factors that contribute to the overall effect. I've identified working memory correlates with prediction abilities. So if their working memory is in any way compromised in terms of capacity, that could be another source of variance or any reduction in performance. So those are the two most obvious ones that I would look at first if I was looking at it, whether it's related at all, whether their degree of decrease in spontaneous or preferred motor tempo predicts their coordination ability with somebody else, but also their working memory capacity, I would say. There might be other things, but those are the two that would be at the front of my mind.
Okay, so thanks again for the talk. I mean, you really covered a lot of ground, and it's really impressive the combination of the models and the theoretical studies and looking at all different aspects together. It seemed to me like I'm always impressed when people manage to bring together this a theoretical and modeling approach, and then looking at it from all the different aspects. I was really impressed and learned a lot, and wrote down lots of notes of papers I need to go and read up on afterwards to catch up on some of the points. So thanks again for the talk, and I hope we'll be able to host you here one day as well in person.
Yeah, thanks. It was a pleasure and great to meet you all virtually. I wish that we could meet properly. Hopefully that chance will come up at some point.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Jason, thank you for organizing this. Bye.
Okay, thanks.
Very much.